Hello, hello. This is the my artifact episode number 3719. Today's date is November 23, 2025. It's been almost like a morning at 7:23 a.m. All right, let's just jump into the question. Let's go. Okay, the question is, what if creativity was measured by sources? Okay, what if creativity is actually measured by? Okay, that is a really good question. Okay, first of all, what exactly is this question and why am I asking this question to myself? This is what if question. Why am I asking this question to myself? What if question is always really interested way to give the answer. It kind of like somehow force you to think about that reality. And when I try to think about that reality, when I try to create that reality, I kind of like utilizing my knowledge and information to kind of like somebody I'm kind of like using my knowledge and information to create that kind of like a reality. Now, why what if question is kind of like a bit more different is because of it's not a kind of like a something a stagnant question. It's not a stagnant answer like a 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. No. The question is actually about why 2 plus 3 is not 5 or is not 4. Okay, yeah. So basically when I ask this question, then probably it's just think that you have to be understand regarding about what is actually meaning of plus, what is actually meaning of is equal to, what is actually meaning of 2, what is actually meaning of 3, and you try to evaluate that thing. And that's what kind of like a something you just asking a question to the kind of like a somebody a basic that does it kind of like a something matter or not. Okay, like why we called as a 2 as a 2, why we called as a value 3 as a 3. That somehow what if question is somewhat kind of like a somebody unlock all the possibility that what it went through and what kind of like a somebody possible way to kind of like a somebody give the right answer. Okay, yeah. So it somehow it felt really good. Okay, yeah. Disclaimer: the information that I'm trying to tell you is not exactly right, is not exactly wrong either. It's raw, it's unfiltered, it's my opinion. So do not believe in any kind of like information that I'm saying, or do not seek for any kind of like information that I'm saying. It's my opinion, and opinion are subjective. Alright. Now let's proceed to the question. The question says that what if creativity was measured by resources? Now, if I'm kind of like asking this question that what if creativity is actually measured by sources or things like what if creativity is actually measured, then what would be that word, particular word? First of all, can creativity is measure? Well, creativity cannot measure. Okay, yeah. And why is that? Because it's a creativity is a it's not a kind of like a something grade. It's not a kind of like a something number. It's not like basically you love somebody. How much do you love? Can you say that thing? Oh yeah. Like I love my mother, I love my father, I love my siblings, I love people around me too. But which person I love the most? Or how should I supposed to kind of like a grade them like a 10 out of 2 or 10 out of 4 or 10 out of 8? It's very hard to give the number. Okay, why? Because it's a kind of like something emotional. We cannot measure emotional value in numbers. Okay, yeah, numbers are we kind of like a resonate that key higher is better and things like that. But the emotions or any kind of like a somebody feeling you cannot measure, and that is somewhat something that kind of like a something a human thing. Okay, yeah. Now, what if we could measure that thing? What if we could measure how much we could love somebody, or how much we have feeling about somebody, or how much we have creativity, or how much we have anger towards each other, or how much, yeah, basically this thing every emotions and feelings that can be measured. So basically if we could kind of like a measure the creativity or other any kind of like a feeling, then what would be that particular word? Then basically is this thing now, this would be kind of like a somebody create a very like kind of like a somebody perception regarding about you. Okay, yeah. Now what is actually perception, what exactly is this thing? Okay, yeah. So since we are born, okay, yeah, uh, we are kind of like a getting values about some certain thing. Okay, yeah. Smartness, then ethics and things and that. Those are values that we are getting from our surrounding, from our education system, from everything. Okay, yeah. Now If I wanted to kind of like simply measure, or if I wanted to understand which person is a good person, then probably we would kind of like look at them in today's standard. Okay, yeah, we would kind of like look at them, how is that particular person is really good, what kind of like a stuff he that did, what kind of like a job he do, what kind of like somebody have a relationship with someone else. So basis on that particular context, we would kind of like measure that particular person is good or not. Okay, yeah, we didn't really exactly measure, we just kind of like simply contemplate that ki, okay, this person is a really good person because he does have good things regarding about in his life. Okay, yeah, but what if we could kind of like started measure this kind of like a feelings and creativity and all those things, then we would kind of like completely rely on number. Okay, yeah, then we would rely on number, that ki how much smartness that he has, how much angry that he has, like a 10 out of 2, or let's just how much creativity that he has, or how much kind of like a something the love that he has. Okay, yeah, so basically it's this thing, we would kind of like simply judging the people by number. Okay, yeah, and this would be kind of like a simply really wrong thing. Okay, right now people are actually judged by kind of like a lot of things. Okay, yeah, as also money is also really important thing too, we also kind of like a judge by money, but not everyone. Okay, yeah, because we also understand that money is a kind of like a simply only and only established by kind of like a simply after some sort of age, and after you got a job and things and that. Okay, yeah, but the kind of like assembly, the how do we supposed to measure, we cannot have that particular machine or any kind of like a things. We have kind of like so many education numbers, like basically we have kind of like assembly how much you score in this particular exam or things or that and that, but it doesn't really tell you regarding about your personality, no, nothing at all. So we didn't really have any kind of like assembly system that kind of like assembly measure you regarding about what exactly you are. Okay, yeah, no, basically, if we could have this particular system that kind of like measure you, then probably is this thing that everyone actually focusing on number. Everyone actually focusing on that. Ki I have kind of like a little less number in angry. I have more number in kind of like some creativity or love, or I have kind of like a more number in kind of like some smartness or things or that and that. And everyone are kind of like a simply focus on increasing those number. Okay, yeah, for this particular purpose they are kind of like assumly going any kind of like going to the kind of like assumly such a school where creativity or other kind of like assumly emotions should supposed to be getting higher number. Okay, and things and that. Okay, if the people who are not really getting those number, then probably people are kind of like doing cheating or things and that, and this would be kind of like something really problematic and things like that. But after all those things, after all I measure, after all the system we could kind of like start to measure this thing, it's not exactly completely true. Okay, let me tell you perspective. Okay, yeah, why we cannot measure our love, or why we cannot measure our feeling, why is that? Okay, yeah, like we are kind of like somebody, we are living in 21st century, and probably like regarding about feeling we should supposed to be measure, right? But we cannot measure, why is that thing? Why is that thing? Okay, so I'm gonna kind of like simply give you a couple of kind of like something example. Okay, yeah, in real life that is actually happened. Okay, yeah, and you have to be understand that key, like you have to understand that particular person perspective, what he was kind of like thinking and things like that. And this is what actually happened. Okay, yeah, uh, I was kind of like hearing some sort of news. Okay, yeah, so there is a bus driver. Okay, and bus driver, a kind of like a passenger bus driver, is kind of like somebody taking a passenger to someone else, somewhere else. Okay, yeah, now basically all those passengers are kind of like unknown to each other because they are kind of like going to somewhere else. Now suddenly what is actually happened, that there is a one kind of like a somebody passenger who kind of like a somebody started and kind of like a somebody doing a ragging. He was kind of like a somebody robbing people. Okay, like basically he have kind of like a somebody gun, and he would kind of like point out the gun to the everyone, says that he bring the money or else you will gonna die and things like that. And also is this thing, there is also one person who kind of like say this thing to the driver, that he you should supposed to be drive towards the location and things like that. Okay, yeah, so basically what does this do is that that particular robber who kind of like rob everyone. Okay, but by the way, bus is actually running. Okay, bus is not stopping. Okay, yeah, the robber actually says to the bus driver that you shouldn't supposed to stop the bus, you should supposed to be drive the bus. Okay, yeah, so he was kind of like driving. Okay, yeah, now basically what exactly happened, he was kind of, that robber is actually rob kind of like somebody took the money of the passenger peoples and took the money of the passengers and things and that and that. Now there is a one good thing, there is a one smart thing that kind of like a some driver did, is that he didn't really stop the bus, but he was kind of like a driving the bus towards the police station. Okay, yeah. And he stopped the bus at the police station, in front of the police station gate. Okay, yeah. And when he stopped, and there is a kind of like a lot of police people was already there, suddenly they kind of like grab those police kind of like grab those robber and kind of like simply stop that particular robbing thing. So basically is this thing, that particular driver was kind of like somebody just a very basic education. He just didn't really he just kind of like really fail, maybe kind of like a somebody fifth standard, okay, or maybe like he didn't really did that much kind of like some education. He was kind of like comes from very poor family and things like that. But that smartness came on that random amount of time, and he actually save almost like those hundreds of passenger, like basically 50, like basically how many, like basically hundreds of passenger in the bus. Okay, yeah. So can you calculate his smartness and things like that? No, we cannot calculate this thing, because let me tell you one thing, na, the problem is that our emotions and feelings and smartness and creativity and everything are actually evoked at some certain time that it needed. Okay, yeah, that it needed. Like basically is this thing that when we are kind of like facing the danger, we are kind of like somebody finding such a kind of like somebody solution that kind of like somebody matter at that time to kind of like a best of them with kind of like somebody as efficient amount of effort it could be possible. And this is where kind of like somebody creativity and smartness and feeling would be kind of like somebody happen. Okay, yeah. Let me tell you another perspective. Okay, yeah. This is also real experience, by the way. Okay, yeah. Almost like a year ago, my mother is kind of like somebody suffering from kind of like some sort of disease. Okay, yeah. She has a kind of like a surgery. Okay. Now, basically, what is actually happened? Okay, that kind of like somebody surgery. In that particular surgery is this thing that surgery actually happened. Like basically is this thing that like I'm not really sure, because my father didn't really told me regarding about that surgery. My parents didn't really told me about that surgery. But what exactly happened, that that surgery is very much complex surgery. Okay, very much complex. Okay, yeah. And basically is this thing that my mother did that surgery. My mother did that surgery and things like that. Okay. My father didn't really tell to the relatives and things like that. Like after the surgery, my father tell to the relative. Now then my mama came. Mama is my brother of my mother. Okay, yeah. By the way, my mother is actually always fighting with my mama. Okay, because of kind of like he was not doing this thing. As also my mama is kind of like a little smaller age in my as compared to my mother. So my mother is always kind of like giving them like, what are you doing with your life and things and that and things like that. Okay, yeah. They're always kind of like a fighting like kind of like some sibling and things like that. But after my mother's surgery, when the mama came, okay, yeah, and basically this thing, mama is kind of like somebody started kind of like somebody crying, but it's not the kind of like a crying that you think it is. A kind of like somebody just no. It's a kind of like somebody a cry that you cannot heard. It is that. It kind of like a thing is that a kind of like somebody my mama was kind of like somebody feeling that her sister is kind of like went through kind of like somebody very horrible surgeries and things like that, and if something went wrong, then I would kind of like lose my sister and things like that. So basically is this thing that my mama is kind of like somebody been really emotional at that time when my mama sees my mother. Okay, yeah. And same thing goes with my mother is also sees my mama too. Like basically my mother is also crying too. But it's a very emotional thing. It's a very silent. There is no kind of like a things. Just like kind of like my mama looked at my mother and my mother looked at my mama, and kind of like somebody they are both crying, but kind of like somebody they just kind of like looked at each other. They didn't really talk. They just looked. They kind of like have kind of like a lump in their eyes. They didn't really talk, and just mama kind of like somebody just went away. Okay, yeah. And went away like basically my mother is in kind of like some ICU or something like that. So my mama is kind of like somebody went away from ICU. he was kind of like a sit outside being really emotional and things like that. Now I was there, okay, I was there, and I seen that particular kind of like assembly context. I seen that particular things that key, how do I supposed to be measure the love? And this is the kind of like assembly the definition of the love. Love is not meant to be kind of like assembly that key how much you love that particular person. The love means that key kind of like assembly how much you care that particular person. And when that kind of like assembly care is actually loss, or when that care is kind of like a somebody is this thing that ki gone, or might be kind of like somebody gone, like basically being emotional is kind of like a thing that ki it kind of like a connect us as a kind of like a somebody human. Okay, yeah, we actually kind of like basically connect, like basically I don't know how do I supposed to explain this thing, like why my mama get emotional, why my mother gets emotional at that particular moment, even after my mother is already kind of like a somebody get outside that danger, like a surgery went successful and things like that, but still my mamas get emotional, my mother get emotional without speaking any kind of like a words or things or nothing really at all. My just mama came, my mama kind of like a sees my mother, my mother sees my mama, and they just both crying, but that cry is not like basically just it's very emotional. It's just like they have numb in their eyes, they just looked at each other, they kind of like simply wipe their tears, but mama kind of like went outside the ICU and kind of like simply sit outside the ICU and kind of like simply sit there for a while, didn't really cry that much, but still it kind of like represent that my mama and my mother has a kind of like a very strong connection in between them. Okay, yeah, as a kind of like simply love. And this is where kind of like simply very defined as a love. That's why we cannot measure a kind of like simply love. Is that what exactly is this thing? Okay, yeah. So that is that. Okay, so that's why we cannot measure the feeling, we cannot measure the creativity, smartness, love, or kind of like a things. It's not. Okay, yeah. Sometimes now sometimes some creativity is kind of like a somebody very unique. Okay, yeah. I'm belong to the India. Okay, yeah. And we have kind of like a somebody term called jugad. Okay, yeah. Jugad is a kind of like a somebody term is kind of like a represent regarding about that ki you are kind of like a somebody solving some sort of thing by kind of like a somebody less efficient resources that you are available at the moment. Okay, and try to solve that problem as quickly for kind of like basically quickly as possible with less resources that we have. That is called kind of like jugad. Okay, yeah. And those jugad is kind of like developed by Indian people, because Indian people are kind of like so much kind of like so much kind of like evolved with kind of like doing a development kind of like less resources. And that is what kind of like I born with it, and that is what kind of like somebody that society has actually been through in everything here. Okay, yeah. And we are kind of like have such a creativity that kind of like somebody just very unique in its own thing. Okay, yeah. And that is what kind of like somebody is this thing that ki our creativity or feeling is cannot able to be measured. It's not, because even if I try to measure this thing, it's completely not possible. Like basically is this thing, how do I supposed to measure that thing? It's not possible. Like basically every person has a kind of like some solving problem by their own thing, and that is what kind of like some beauty of it. Okay, yeah. I seen lot of kind of like somebody the author like authenticated people who kind of like a thought that they have kind of like a lot of creativity and lot of kind of like a smartness and things like that. They fail, but sometimes kind of like some people who didn't really expect that they would kind of like do something very kind of like a creative, or do something very kind of like a smartness. They kind of like do such a smartness that kind of like shape the society and things like that. Like the kind of like that bus driver. Okay, yeah, who did something kind of like a saving hundreds of passenger on their bus. Like basically this is what kind of like a something is that na? Like how do you supposed to kind of like define that particular person didn't really kind of like went to the education, he just kind of like a fail in 5th standard. So probably what should you supposed to expect from creativity from the person who fail in 5th standard? Obviously nothing, but that particular person kind of like a save hundreds of people, hundreds of passenger in his bus. So basically his action is kind of like a completely not associate with kind of like a what kind of like education that he did. So basically this thing, our feelings and emotions and smartness and things are cannot able to be measured. And if we kind of like build such a system that we could kind of like assembly we could kind of like somebody that can measure it out system, that system is not kind of like assembly fully developed yet, or that system is not kind of like assembly fully kind of like assembly measure that particular values, because sometimes some of the values or sometimes some of the kind of like emotions and feelings are kind of like assembly act very differently. very differently. Example is this thing that ki the person who is kind of like a fall in love, they have kind of like a similar relationship for almost like a more than 15 year. Now basically the way that they kind of like a simply talk to each other is very much differently as compared to the people who kind of like a fall in relationship for kind of like a simply just a month ago. Okay, yeah. So basically this thing, the people who are actually falling in love kind of like a month ago, they are kind of like a simply talking very lovey-dovey. Okay, they are talking about like a babu, shona, baby and things and that. Okay, yeah, because they don't really understand what is actually love. But the people who are kind of like been in relationship for almost like a 15 year and they understand each other a lot, their love language kind of like a bit more different. Okay, yeah. And who is exactly loving most? The people who are kind of like loving almost like a 3 months ago, they are loving the most because their action is kind of like loving, they are kind of like taking care of each other. It's the same thing, but the problem is that now you just can't. You just can't. Sometime kind of like somebody, the people who are kind of like loving, have a relationship for 15 years, they kind of like a think that they love each other most, but might be they are kind of like a hate each other most too. And this is what kind of like a thing it is. Love is a kind of like a very much different thing. Emotion is a kind of like a very different thing. Okay, yeah. Sometimes it kind of like a shows a kind of like a very higher value. Sometimes it kind of like a shows very lower value too. So regarding about is this thing, can we able to measure our creativity, our emotions, our thought process, our kind of like assembly feelings and things? We cannot. And if we kind of like build such a system, then probably is this thing what will gonna happen, that key most of the people are kind of like a went through the number. Okay, focus on just a number, that key how much bigger number do I have regarding about creativity and things like that. And those are very false way to kind of like count that thing, because still emotion cannot able to be measured. Okay, even if there is a how good is that system or things or that or something like that, it's not. It's definitely not. Okay, yeah, because it is that na ki we are not a robot. We are not kind of like a born with a specification that you have this kind of like a things and that. Definitely not. Human are kind of like a somebody dumb. At the same time, it kind of like a super smart. At the same time too. And I'm talking about only the same person. And this is what kind of like a somebody human we are. Okay. Alright, this is it. I should supposed to be end here. And thank you.